Once upon a time, in a faraway land,
What are fairy stories?
The strange and wondrous place where nothing is as it seems.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest?
Fairy is a perilous land.
Before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep
It
well.
is the place you visit
A world
in your
of
dreams.
myth and magic.
when the clock began to
The
chime
evening
midnight,
star sailed down through the
A
sky.
mysterious voice began calling to the sad
She
princess.
pricked her finger with her needle. 3 drops of blood fell on the
In a
small
trance,
white
she
finger.
followed the haunting
And peered
sound
into the
of the
hollow
winding
tree.
stairway to the top of the
You
tower.
can read along with me in your book.
she waved her wand and said the magic words.
Let's begin now.
Well met, witches. We gather tonight to continue our discussion about the devil in fairy tale, folklore, and witchcraft. And we have the opportunity tonight to hear from Brett Hollyhead how this pertains to his own culture and practice as the Witch of the Welsh Marches. Brett, what would you like to tell us about yourself?
So, hi everyone, my name's Brett. So, yes, I am the Witch of the Welsh Marches, formerly known as the Witch of Salopia, and I am a practicing folk witch that adopts ritualist aspects into my practice that are heavily based within my culture. So, for those who do not know, the Welsh Marches is the hybridization of the Anglicised and the Welsh side counties that stipulate the borderlands. So that's places like Shropshire, Herefordshire, Montgomeryshire. And in my practice, I incorporate the shared customs, folklores, and beliefs. I'm also an avid tassiomancer, and I am a public speaker across the UK. I deliver talks and workshops along with my Coven, the Sarffes Goch, which means the Coven of the Red Serpent.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'd like to, at the beginning, say if people wish to find you, where's a good spot they can track you down?
Oh, I'm all over the place, really. I spread out. But you can find me on all the social medias. So I'm on TikTok, but I mostly just mess about on there just to try and keep hip and trendy. My main platforms are on Twitter, Instagram. They're under Witch of Salopia. I post a lot of folklore from my home county, and I'm also on Facebook as well.
Wonderful. And we have with us returning Dave Gaddy, the Weathered Wise Man. How are you, Dave?
I'm doing great. How are you, Aaron?
I'm wonderful. Do you have anything you'd like to tell people about events in July?
Yes, thanks for that lead in. Actually, the 15th through the 17th of July, I will be presenting a class on ancestral magic and a class on the magic of absolutes at Mystic South here in Atlanta.
Wonderful. Super excited about that. And I'm your host, Frater Aaron, a graduate of the Mystery School of the Fellowship of the Phoenix, a religious organization for queer neo-pagan people. And like I said, we'll be discussing today the role of the devil in our craft and in folklore. Recently, we discussed the story The Devil in the Green Coat, also sometimes titled Bearskin. And today we'll look at 2 other tales from the Grimm household tales. The Devil's Sooty Brother, which we referred to a little bit in the last episode and was also published in 1812, and The Peasant and the Devil, which was added by the Grimm brothers for the 5th edition, I believe in 1847, I believe. Brett, you brought The Peasant and the Devil to our attention. What made you think of that tale specifically?
Yeah, so the Peasant and the Devil has a lot of connections with the Welsh folk tales, as well as the Welsh Marches folk tales that we commonly refer to as Jack O'Kent or David Haragedd, in which a peasant or someone who works on the farm tricks the devil in very similar manner. So in the Peasant and Devil story, there's the farming aspect where the peasant tricks the devil by planting various vegetables in the ground and asks him which part of the vegetable you'd like to collect, whether it be the top or the bottom, and we have the exact same thing within our folklore here, but under different names and different circumstances.
And in the story, the peasant comes across the devil sitting on top of coal in the field,
Yes.
And the devil is described as a little black creature or a little black man. And I believe in the Devil's Sooty Brother, the soldier in that story also comes across a devil that is described as a little man or a little creature, different from the previous story I was looking at, where we see a fancy man in a green coat. So already there's some differences in the portrayal of the devil within Grimm Tales. I caught notice of that he's called a little black man a devil, and not specifically the devil as well. And was wondering if then we're seeing a creature from folklore, possibly, that's being referred to as a devil here.
Absolutely, yeah. I think if there's any character that has suffered quite simplistic renditions when it comes to the character or as to what the devil is, then it's no other than the devil in folklore. I think a lot of people perceive the devil as being a character that's either defined by the stereotypes, such as the classical red man with horns and cloven feet, or they perceive him more metaphorically as the embodiment of evil, whether that being in corporal form or incarnate. But the devil in folklore has quite a few different guises. So within the Welsh stream of folklore, or within the Welsh Marches, he can be perceived as the man in black. We often call him Yr Ysbryd Drwg, the bad spirit, or we call him Old Scratch, where I'm from. And he comes dressed in black clothes, or he can come in anthropomorphic form, so he can be disguised as a frog. Like you said, a very little creature, which is synonymous with fairy folklore. So we have quite a few branches of fairy folklore that pertain to different creatures. So we have Bucca, Bachod, Pucca. There's all sorts of different creatures that have very similar characteristics. But it's interesting within the German folklore, because as I am quite an avid study of the witch trials, it's interesting when you read people from the German culture, they'll refer to the devil as Fidele, which means little feather, I think. And he is often portrayed wearing the most fanciest clothes, because there's the connection with the whole idea of a demonic witch, in which the witch, or someone who wants to become a witch, must sleep with the devil in order to renounce their Christianity. And I can't think of a better way for the devil to do that in order to seduce them. And what better way than to wear fancy clothes? But in our folklore, he can appear in many different guises. And it's not necessarily a man either. He can appear as a woman. So it crosses that gender spectrum. He can appear as various animals, or even a mist, but sometimes he's not very much defined. If anything, he's defined more as an eerie feeling, or even a smell. There's one famous story that I love to talk about, which is Pentravolis, which is near the Denbighshire region, I think, where a man called John was walking down a road and he saw the devil just lazing about on a hedgeway, but his head was on one side of the hedge and his feet were on the other. And he's not necessarily described in characteristic, obviously, than the cloven hooves, but it's the smell that captures it, because there's this sulfuric aroma that fills the air and it's left behind. But yeah, he can come in many different guises, or she, or they.
Interesting. The sulfuric fumes reminds me also, again, he comes across the devil sitting on a pile of glowing coal. And in the devil's sooty brother, there's an element of that as well, because the soldier protagonist goes to hell to tend the fires for the devil.
Yes.
That element is missing in the devil in the green coat. Do you think there's something specific about the fires and the coal that are present in the story?
Oh, possibly. I think with the coal aspect, I think we have a different attachment to it, because a lot of our Halloween tradition and customs have the coal aspect featured in our stories, where there is an evil figure that's been attached to quite a few figures throughout folkloric history, but they either trick the devil to the point where they're not allowed to go into hell as a result from their bad actions in life, and the devil just kicks them out, so they're left to wander the otherworld, or the liminal in between, with only a piece of coal to light their way, which is what we attach to the jack-o'-lantern. But within the devil folklore aspects of our storytelling, it's not necessarily the same as going to hell. It's more the devil is featured within our land, and he comes to us in our times of grievances, or when we've hit in rock bottom, especially when we're suffering with poverty. And there is the aspect, especially with the Sooty Brother, there is the aspect of servitude to the devil, or giving something back to the devil. So I know in the Sooty Brother that Hans, the discharged soldier, has to spend 7 years in hell doing these services. But it's a little bit different from our folklore. We don't have such an extended time period. We have more of an instant direct kind of result kind of thing. So one of our famous stories, and probably the most famous of all, it happens in Aberystwyth, where a elderly woman is distraught because she loses her cattle across the other side of the river and she can't reach them. And in her distress, the devil appears to her and says that he'll build her a bridge. And she comes back in the morning and she finds a bridge. There is one condition, that the first living thing that crosses over that bridge belongs to him. And so she tricks him by throwing a piece of bread over the bridge, and the first thing that crosses over it is a dog. So it's more tricking the devil almost, rather than acts of servitude towards him. Although he's quite vilified and feared, he's often seen as aloof, quite clumsy, and quite stupid, actually, to invoke sympathy for him.
Dave, in your Appalachian folklore and culture, how similar is the character of the devil and the way that people interacted with him?
Actually, in that folklore, I'm hearing a lot of similarities listening to Brett. I mean, I've heard him referred to as Old Scratch.
Yes.
Just so much of the same type tales. I mean, even if you go to the old country song, The Devil Went Down to Georgia, it's all about tricking the devil and being able to get one over on him. Just like with the stories here, the thing is outfoxing the fox at the end of the story. And you get a lot of that in the same folklore. Now, don't get me wrong. There are just as many down here that see the devil around every corner and react in fear. But there's that trickster element of the devil also. And a lot of the old Appalachian folk tales deal with that wily little man who's out to make a bargain.
We talked about the desperation factor, that oftentimes the character of the devil will come upon someone when they're at their bottom or they're down on their luck. How much does that play into then the devil ever as a salvific figure or someone who's bestowing gifts?
I think we've always seen that in the craft.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about it, the church has always seen witches as selling their soul to the devil in order to gain power.
Mm-hmm.
But with these, I don't necessarily see the selling of the soul as much as let's make a deal.
Yeah, I'm very much in the same about here. So if we look towards the witch trials, there is that sense of a peripheral force that lingers upon the outside of society that whispers within those ears who are more open to listening to these illustrious and tempting whispers of power and carnal knowledge. So you'll find within European folklore that most witches would go to these secret places, such as the top of the mountains or in the woodlands, and they would relish in ecstasy that was so repressed by the church, as they had a spiritual monopoly on all things, and therefore anything that resided outside of the Christian orthodoxy was seen as demonic. So within that kind of aspect, we can interpret the devil to be so much like a liberator, that the actual gift he bestows is more of freedom. And you'll see it within folkloric aspects that the devil is not necessarily the same devil that you'll see as Satan in the Bible, but it's more of a nocturnal figure that is liminal, who is a guide, who bestows wisdom and bestows power in order to fight corruption, to fight those who oppress us, especially within a society that like devalues vulnerability, or wants you to conform to a strict set of coherent values. But within the folklore, like Dave said, it's more about him being tricked, about him, especially within my region as well, it's more of him being a numinous force that's inherently tied to the geographical location. So it's interesting that some of these stories share different aspects. Obviously, the Brothers Grimm, they were so influential in their work that a lot of anthropologists and folklorists looked to them, because when they were setting up these stories, it was almost for a sense of romantic nationalism, that they wanted to preserve the heritage and the culture by looking at these stories. And then people from different countries were looking at these people saying, oh my God, I should do this. We could do this here. And some of these stories are obviously passed over, especially when people were migrating to different countries, such as America. They take these stories with them. But when it comes to gifts, it's not necessarily gifts within my region. It's more the devil was synonymous with giants almost, that he uprooted the earth, and wherever he trod, there was hills left in his wake, or there'd be rocks thrown about all over the place. But if anything, your freedom was more of a gift from him. If you could out-trick him, that was your gift, really.
Mm-hmm.
And bringing up the concept of the folk devil being related to the land where you reside, that brings up the concept of the local devil as well, which may or may not be tied to the Christian devil being a local spirit.
Yeah, it's an extremely nuanced topic. It really is. Because it ponders upon deep psychological questions as well as to what we perceive the devil to be, whether he's like the arch enemy of God, or whether he is this fragmented psychological concept that's a part of our unconscious and representing our psyche, or whether he is an actual evil incarnate spirit that tempts us away in order to obtain our souls. But as I've always said, as a practicing folk witch that's inherently tied to my land and my culture, I've always seen the devil as not a singular being. It's more of a collective term that embodies the spirits of the land, which is why so many different interactions will show off different aspects of this characteristic of what we call the devil, and it's just an easy title to bestow upon it. So it's more about representing the vitality and the fertility of the land, almost, that nature in itself is carnal, it's ferocious, it's terrifying, but it's also pleasant, it's beautiful, it's liberating away from what humanity has imposed upon it. So within the folk devil itself, we see different aspects attached to the folk devil, not necessarily just in stories as him being in human form or animal form, but there are more or less attachments to him in the plant world, in nature world. So we have certain trees, certain plants that have the devil's bearing. I mean, within my home, you only have to walk down the road and you stumble across somewhere called the devil's chair, or you find a herb that's at the devil's trumpet or the devil's crabapple. And the way I perceive that is that the devil is linked to these poisonous plants because we perceive them as dangerous. We perceive them as something that we should never go near, that we shouldn't touch unless we have a very deep understanding with it. It always comes with a warning. But when you look at these poisonous plants, yes, they can kill you if you use them in a wrong way, but they can also offer such deep, intimate knowledge of nature when they're used for medicinal purposes. So the examples I use would be things like foxglove. So foxglove is associated with the devil. We have the devil's fingers, dead man's fingers, fairy bells. So we have that fairy connection there. But then when you look at medicinal records, the foxglove itself has had such a huge influence in the development of digitalis, which is for heart conditions. So linking it back to the devil, it is seen as this wider ecological force that embodies everything within the land, both what we see as evil or dangerous, as well as magnificent and numinous.
Yeah, the linking of things that are perceived as dangerous to the character of the devil is something that also happened in the legends of fairy, I believe. So don't walk along this road late at night because this type fairy might come and take you away, as a warning story for don't stay out drinking too late because you're going to walk off the cliff, or things like that was an example I heard recently from Dr. Hunton. And it speaks to this idea of the devil as a collection of spirits, a collective of entities. In the previous episode, I brought up the idea of Satan, but didn't go into it too far. But as specifically, the role of Satan was as the accuser, or as I've heard described as the prosecuting attorney, working for the same God, working for the same judicial system as your appointed defendant's attorney, but his role is as the accuser, which doesn't necessarily make him evil, but also doesn't make him the force of nature that we would be working with in the wild woods. And bringing it back to the witchcraft that I'm familiar with, we do call out the devil as the walker in the woods or the walker behind the woods, but it is very vague. Is that these woods that I happen to be in now? Is it the idea of woods overall? Is it what is this figure that we're working with? You have any ideas churning, Dave?
Well, I mean, coming from the rural South, there's so much of the devil made me do it down here. The idea of, and there's such a conflicting look at the devil in the South United States. On one hand, you do get the culmination of the different spirits, and I think that's more from the mountain folk, the ones who practice folk magic. But then again, you have that hardcore church look at Satan as evil incarnate, as the antithesis of God. And it's like you were talking about, Brett. We have so many references to the devil down here. Like, we have areas like in North Carolina, where I come from, there's a place called the Devil's Stomping Grounds. And in this area, supposedly because there's no vegetation that grows there in a circle, that's where the devil comes out at night and does his dances. So just little things like that. and the acknowledge of him as a collective of spirits. Like I said, you see that more in the mountains of the South and throughout the Appalachian mountain range, that it's kind of like you see the nature spirits. I hear so much of what you're talking about, Brett, and it makes me understand the migration of some of the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish over into the Appalachians,
Yes.
into that area. And that's why there's such a strong background of that.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Like, I think with the devil as a being, he is a being of contradiction. It's paradoxical almost, is that I think no matter how much we comprehend the figure, we're never going to be able to truly fully understand him because he is paradoxical. And I think that's what draws us closer to the spirit, is that this sense of mysticism keeps us wanting. And as a practicing witch, and I'm sure many people will relate to me on this, it's our yearning for connection that allows us to go to these sites where the worlds converge together and they coalesce, where we want to not necessarily obtain power like the witches of the trials almost were accused of doing, but to connect to something that was more beyond the physical realm, something that was transcendental to the physical. There's so much what you're saying as well, Dave. I keep nodding my head because like I'm from a rural area myself, so my home is Shropshire and Montgomeryshire, which is the borderland between Wales and England, and you couldn't walk a mile without bumping into a field. So I'm very much a country boy. I should have worn dungarees, really. But it's so ingrained into our language that we don't necessarily see the devil as part of our inherent culture, but it is. Like, as a child, I had to be told, if I didn't act or behave a certain way, that the devil would come and get me. And it's almost perceived as a scapegoat for us to attach evil onto this figure. And it's interesting as well, actually, mention Satan as the adversary, because like you said, it wasn't necessarily attached to one singular being. It was seen as this angelic force acting on behalf of God, especially in the book of Job, where Satan accuses Job of acting not out of piety, but for his own self-service. And therefore, we have the trials and tribulations of Job, which is a horrific reader, really. It makes you see God in a different way. And it wasn't until later on in the proto-canonical book process that you see this dualism aspect come in, when the Bible was merging in with these Babylonian and other different cultures where they had different spirits that may have represented something evil. And I don't think it was until, I think it was Irenaeus, and people like Augustus, who cemented the devil as this figure of pure evil, where the sin of pride comes in. But it's interesting within the folklore as well, because the pride aspect does come in. This devil's seen as an outlandish figure who is proud and he's boastful. So I do prefer to see it more as a collective of spirits, because especially within the witch trials over here within Wales and England, when you look at the European trials, you'll see this aspect of a demonic witch come into play, which is a witch that will gather at these sabbatical meetings. They will revel in orgiastic revelry. They'll feast together, and they'll have aspects of cannibalism. They will have malignant magic and, like I said, orgies. But this idea of a Sabbath and the demonic witch never came fully into contact with our countries here, because it was dealt with a sense of ambiguity. So there was not a complete sense as to what a witch was, but it focused more on the maleficent aspects, that a witch didn't necessarily need to go to these sabbatical meetings. In fact, the Sabbath was quite absent away from our trial records. It wasn't until later on in the 16th century that it kind of became firmly attached, and then later on in folkloric belief. But we had this idea that rather than having sex with the devil or becoming a demonic witch, we had the idea of the witch being given a familiar. And the familiar spirit is really complex and nuanced, because it's seen as a demon that's either in corporeal form or is physical. So you have the stereotypical image of the cat with the witch, or the frog with the witch. But this familiar spirit is almost an amalgamation of different things. So it's seen as a demon that's given by the devil, or it's passed down through inheritancy, or it is seen as a fairy. So you'll see in Welsh folklore, a lot of cunning folk and witches don't necessarily make a deal with the devil to be given power. They make a deal with fair folk, or the Tol Teg, who are seen as denizens of the otherworld, or inherently related to the natural landscape itself. And it's them who are seen as the magical embodiments of the otherworld. And they're the ones that give the ability to the cunning folk, to the witch. And that gets a lot of mixed in with demons. As you'll see, like a lot of church records, you'll see that fairies are nothing more than just demons of the devil's doing. And I think a lot of our folklore is from a Christian aspect. You'll see in the folklore tales that it is seen as one singular figure, that the devil can traverse all these different locations. and act in different ways, but it's always this one person. But I think as we move away from this, I'm going to say monotheistic view of the devil as a pure being, we see a more wider reaching view of him. We're starting to understand it more as we see different interpretations of what he is, especially when we look, like I said, within the wider aspects of folklore, as him being assimilated with giants where he creates the land. I don't think God would give the devil such power, you know what I mean, if there was any kind of crossover with that. But yeah, it's really interesting to see the developments of the devil and how we give different interpretations, different meanings. And I think as witchcraft and paganism progresses, I don't think there'll ever be one agreement point. It'll always be something that contradicts, and I think it's wonderful. I think it should be that way. And I think if the devil is a singular figure, I think he'll laugh at the horns that we've given him, the new tails that we've adorned him with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate that in the just the few tales that we're looking at right now from the Brothers Grimm, we already have 3 different portrayals of the figure that can manifest in different ways based on where he's appearing to these protagonists. And so the peasant and the devil becoming closer to the folklore that you're familiar with in the Welsh lands, and the other 2 echoing a bit more the witchcraft lore of the Germanic trial records. In those stories, there is almost an element of power given, as well as something that's taboo being asked. So in both the Sooty Brother and in the Devil in the Green Coat, the protagonist is forbidden to wash for 7 years. He can't cut his hair or his nails or take a bath. Did you have any thoughts about that part of it, Dave?
I thought it was unique because, I mean, if you look at the history of the Christian church, I mean, the devil has, even though they've given him a sort of divinity, and if you look at the creation stories and all that, Satan was the most beautiful angel, Lucifer. So the thing is, for them to give him this unsavory element, and by the asking of the don't wash, it kind of throws into the mix the fact that the devil requires us to get a little dirty. Unlike the cleanliness of the church, of God, the devil offers that other end of it. Which exactly.
Speaking of other ends, just funny you say that because it's interesting that you bring up the dirty aspects of it. So yeah, I mean, one of the way the witches from the German region would renounce their Christianity was to kiss the devil's anus. I mean, the other end of it.
I saw something on Facebook about that today. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a part of trying to make the devil appear dirty, and it's just like one of the things that you brought out earlier was showing the devil as a liberator. And if you look at biblical texts, the trials and the tribulations aren't brought on by the devil. They're given by God. The devil is the one who's asking you to think about things, to bring out, okay, so if your God is so faithful, then do this.
Absolutely, I agree. Especially within the Reformation period, you'll see that cunning folk, specifically, were scorned. They were scorned by everyone because as Christians were coming together to question their held beliefs about God, especially at such a turbulent time in history when the Church of England was being set up away from the Catholic Church, there was the idea that, like you said, the trials and tribulations were given by God as a way for people to have an internal reflection, to look upon their own piety and to perceive their own sinful nature and to repent. But cunning folk, in a way, and witches, as I said, were given the power by God or by the devil in order to bring about that repentance, to bring about these horrible, disastrous forms, in order for people to reach this pivotal point in their life where they've got to think, okay, I've got to turn to God. Whereas the cunning folk were scorned because they provided the blockway for that. They gave the charms, they gave the healing spells to fix their situation or to heal their livestock that were being cursed or to protect themselves through the use of potropate magic. And that's why they were scorned. So I love that aspect that, yeah, there is this belief that Christians had, the idea that these horrible things that happen to people of everyday communities was given by God as a way for them to transcend, in a way to become more closer to God, rather than blaming it specifically on the devil. The devil's more of the one who brings it about.
I liked the idea of the liberator in this aspect as well, and that we see him giving an ordeal to the protagonist that is it's a forced breaking of taboos with the norms of society. Excuse the expression, but like an embrace of the left-hand path of doing what is taboo and really disgusting to yourself. Even, this is something about confronting the norms of society and breaking those. And in return, the protagonist is given some powers. So in the Devil in the Green Coat, he has pockets full of money all the time. And in the Devil's Sooty Brother, he's tending the devil's cauldrons. But when he peeks in the cauldrons, he sees his military superiors that were hard on him during his career as a soldier. And I completely read that as him being given power over his enemies, as he continues to stoke the fires beneath these kettles. And those that element is only present in those two stories. Did you have any other thoughts about kind of that part of the arc of the story, Dave?
I just thought, like I said, I thought it was interesting that it was a trade-off. You got to get a little dirty, and then you get your power. But isn't that how life in general works? You got to get your hands dirty to get what you need, what needs to be accomplished. Even within witchcraft, you've got to do the work. And it's not like each one of these people were gifted something for free. They had a requirement. They had a job to do. And after they got that job done, or in the process of doing that job, like you said, the power over the enemies.
Absolutely.
I mean, and all that took was that little glimpse just to get that realization. Okay, not so bad.
In The Peasant and the Devil, it follows a completely different plot line. Do you want to tell us what happens after the peasant makes his deal with the devil, Brett?
So this is where I'll introduce my Welsh folklore. It's practically the same, really. So from what I can remember from the peasant and the devil wants his soul, basically, and he's given powers or certain agreements for prosperous weather in order to bring forth good crops. So the peasant plants different things are in the field, and there's an agreement stricken between the devil and himself as to which one they will receive. And so the devil asks for the top part. So the peasant sows in turnips. So when the turnips come round, the peasant receives the beautiful bounty that is the harvest, and the devil receives nothing but leaves. So the devil, being tricked in the next year, brings about a great bountiful of weather and says, okay, I want the bottom this time. So the peasant sows grain instead. So when the wheat is brought forth, he takes the top part. The devil's left nothing more than just the odd little strands bit. So he's really outwitted. It's the very same thing that happens in Dafydd Haragedd. So this is a story from the Trefyglais region. I can't speak at the moment. From the Trefyglais region, in which Dafydd Haragedd is a worker on a farm, or a servant, and his master attends church and asks him to look over the farm to stop the crows from destroying the harvest. But it is said that Dafydd has a deal that's striked with the devil for great amounts of power, and so he commands these crows, and he secures them in a barn, which is today still known as the Crow Barn. And the master scorns him for this, like, why the hell did you leave my field unattended? But he's surprised to find out that the barn is still intact with these crows, and the fields are untouched. The same thing happens with the turnips and the wheat, so they sow the same thing, and the devil's tricked that way. But there's another element to the story where the devil's tricked even further, is that the devil said that when Dafydd dies, if he is brought out of the house a certain way, so through the door, through the window, or over the side of the bed, if he's buried within a churchyard or in the church itself, then he has possession over his soul. So cunningly, David, upon his deathbed, says that when he dies, his entrails should be taken out and thrown upon a dunghill, or sometimes an anthill, depending on the folklore. And depending whether a raven or a dove pecks at it, that'll be the outcome of what's going to happen. The raven comes down and pecks at his entrails, and so to trick the devil, David is taken out through the wall and he's buried underneath the church wall itself, the very middle bit of the wall between the churchyard and the church, fooling the devil so he can't take possession of his soul. And we have an old little rhyme of it, really. So it's David haragedd rhyw, falson farw, falson view, which is David haragedd, badly bred, false when alive, false when dead. So there's a huge cunning aspect of this that, yeah, it's the other way around, almost like the peasant and David, or Jack O'Kenta from the English version, are the ones who get down and dirty on their own accord rather than being forced to by the devil.
So are these stories communicating that it's okay for us to have dealings with the devil as long as we outsmart him in the end?
Like to think so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the devil's seen as a very stupid character, so if you come across him, you can easily outwit him. It just, it takes a bit of courage to do so. But it always makes you feel sad for him a little bit. It does make you feel really sad for him because he's lonely. But the best thing is about our folklore that there is a community aspect to it. So the devil's not always a trick. He just goes sometimes to remind people of morality and to engage in the everyday card game. So one of my favourite stories is when the devil came down to the Jackboat Inn, which is a pub near, I think it's the Ironbridge region in Shropshire, where he appears as a very handsome man, and he goes into this pub and he challenges the people in there to a card game. And so he plays a few cards, and one of the people in there drops a card upon the floor, and it's only when he looks under the table that he notices that this man has very hairy legs and cloven feet. And upon recognizing that this is the very evil spirit that they've been warned about in the Bible, the devil does nothing except for evaporate into a mist almost and go out of the building, just leaving the echo of his laughter. So there's a lot of trickster elements in there. So sometimes the devil can be easy to trick, sometimes he just likes to scare us.
Yeah, as someone who's been encouraging people to think of their magic and their work with materia as relationship based between the practitioner and the spirit, like, I don't know what to do with these stories. They're like it's like, don't treat your spirits this way.
Absolutely.
But if you look at the end of this, the devil was really good natured about the results. He's like, okay, you outfoxed me. I mean, yes, he did get mad, but it's kind of like at the end, it's kind of like, got to give you credit. You did it.
Absolutely. Although I will argue in some aspects of our folklore, he's still trying to this day to destroy us. So the most famous of the devil folklore stories from where I'm from is the Stiper Stones. And this has had a devil attachment to it since the 1500s. So the Stiper Stones are a huge, huge rock formation of quartz rock, and it's very beautiful. If anyone ever comes in this region, I definitely suggest going there because it's absolutely beautiful. It's a very quiet location surrounded by fields of heather almost. And it is said that the devil came from Ireland over into Shropshire, which is formerly known as Satanic County because he has a proclivity for the area. But he marched over here in order to fill Hell's Gutter, which is like a dam. And for some strange reason, because the devil has a weird sense of fashion, he was wearing a beautiful apron, carrying these rocks in there. And because it was a hot day, he decided to take a rest, but the apron snapped and the rock spilled forth onto the ground, which is known as the Stiper Stones to this day. But he is still jumping on the stones to this day, and it is said that when they are submerged into the ground, he will destroy the land itself. So he's still trying. But it's really, like I said, it's that being of contradiction, because the Stiper Stones is known as our Covenant, shall we say. It's the satanic gathering. On the 22nd of December, it's where the witches, all evil spirits and creatures, gather together to celebrate and to select the king of evil. So although it's a place of great celebration, which, yes, I shall be going, come with me on December, we'll fly together, it's also seen as a ruined place, and especially with the warning that if anyone goes there at midnight, you'll either be greatly inspired or driven absolutely insane. So yeah, sometimes he's friendly and there's a good aspect to it, but other times he's still trying to destroy us.
And there are so many things in the Southern culture that are like that. I mean, it's like listening to my family talk. I mean, so many of these, I can remember stories just like this coming from my grandmother when I was a child. If you look at most folk stories anyway, I mean, once the church, and more so after the Reformation over across the pond, but even with the church influence here, you see a Christianization of certain folklore. in the South particularly, you don't so much get the devil, the little red man with the horns and the tail when the pitchfork. You get this ominous, evil, projection of the devil, and it's trust me, it's utilized a lot down here. To the point that even when we go to Pride celebrations here, you've got all these church people that are protesting. You're going to hell. That might worry me, but it kind of doesn't. With my craft, no, I'm not going to worry. But just like I said, you see so much of the, for lack of a better word, demonization of the devil. In the South U.S., more so because, and this is going to sound horrible when I say it, a lot of the church population in the South is more uneducated. So it's more of a let's follow the crowd.
I think some of that echoes what Brett was saying about how even though he was outsmarted this time, he still is biding his time, waiting for, to destruct the populace.
Like you were talking about earlier, Brett, that devil's going to get you thing.
It is. It's so interwoven into everyone's culture. I think it's like on a singular individual level, we see the devil portrayed in even our earliest childhood memories. So where I grew up, obviously we have the idea, I'm sure it's common across different cultures, the idea of the bogeyman, this person or this mist or this otherworldly being that will come and get you if you act out of line in accordance with your parents' wishes. But the bogeyman within my culture, it's so interlinked with the idea of a household familial spirit that has almost been, excuse the language, bastardized to become this more evil thing that has no semblance of respect to it, that is almost seen as a very malicious, malignant figure. Especially with the household fairy in my tradition, it's called the Bugan. And the Bugan was said to be a household spirit that would clean your house for you as long as you kept tidy, and it'd help out with certain domestic tasks as long as you left it an offering. But then you see it later on transform into something that's a spectre, something that's really horrid. And on the wider aspect, I think deep down as a culture, especially I got to talk on behalf of where I'm from, is that Christianity for so long has been the dominant religion that it has been ingrained in our culture that it's very hard to separate that idea of this dualism that good and evil exist and they're completely in combat with each other. But I don't know if you know about this actually, in the recent census, I think it was in 2021 that Christianity is starting to decrease now. It's starting to decrease and paganism is starting to slowly rise. In fact, Christianity is no longer the dominant religion of this country. It's about 40%, so it's less than half. So I think people are starting to drift away from these doctrines that are seen as quite dogmatic, that are seen as restrictive, as opposed to natural living. So, you have these horrible Christian ideas that, oh, if you're gay, if you're LGBT, if you're a woman, you're awful, you should be punished, you should be this, that, and the other. I won't go into too much into it, it's quite triggering for people, but now we see the rise into something. We see the reclamation of the devil. We see him being reclaimed as this figure, along with other aspects such as the fairy folk or various gods and goddesses. We see them as being more connected to the wild, not necessarily as old remnants of something that's carried on throughout history. Like we see the memory of folk belief, but obviously that folk belief is inherently twined with Christian culture. We have to pan it out to find out. So it's not necessarily a continuation of pagan beliefs that we had since the dawn of time. It is inherently Christian, but we are seeing it from a more wider perspective. We're appreciating it more that the gods are not necessarily these omnipotent people or singular figures, let's say, in the cloud judging us, but they're seen more within the earth, within the landscape itself. And it's more wild. And I suppose it's to ourselves to remember that we are not at the center of nature. We are part of it. And especially in today's age as well, where we have such pressing issues such as climate change, I think that story or the idea of it, the stories that we tell and the idea of gods being in the land or the devil being the collective spirit are more useful now than ever, that we should look at these stories and say, okay, yeah, what is it actually telling us that we can link back to this wild force, and that we need to reconnect and to appreciate what nature actually is before it's too late. I mean, we're always saying that nature's starting to reclaim her land back, these horrible tsunamis and earthquakes and natural disasters. And you can see connections with this within the devil folklore, especially with him being more portrayed as giants, where he's seen as trying to destroy the land when people are stopped giving him offerings. You can see semblances here. So I think there's a message to be told in that.
Continuing with that thought, is there a way that these folk tales and legends are applied to your personal practice?
Absolutely. As a folk witch, it's the shared customs, traditions, values, beliefs. They all comprise a massive element in my folk craft. So as a practicing folk witch, I do look to the cunning folk and the witches and what they practice and incorporate that into my practice. But when it comes to the actual folk tales themselves, yes, they do. So we have one of the massive folk tales, actually. It's not necessarily related to the devil. Well, it is sort of, but drifting away from it a little bit, we have such massive attachments to our natural features in the landscape, and one of them being our rivers. So the largest river in Britain is known as the River Severn, or in Welsh we call it the Afon Havren. Havren, or Sabrina, is regarded as a goddess through the process of apotheosis. She was a nymph who was drowned and became the embodiment of the river as a goddess herself, and that incorporates into my practice. So there's so many folk tales attached to her. In regards to the devil, I see him as being not an entity necessarily to worship. I don't go out there and worship him as this god that I am supposed to have every command. I'm supposed to go with every command he says, basically. But I see him more as an ominous force. I see him more as a teacher that relinquishes the restraints that are placed upon our society and our culture. And I suppose it presides more over personal power, that the devil itself represents more of a personal reclamation of our own personal power, and that it is this collective of spirits. And some of my favourite folktales, actually, so you will see the idea of the devil being the form of a toad. So that comes into my folk practices as well. So I'll have a load of toads seen as the embodiment of my familiar spirit, and that has links with our later folk tales attached to the devil. So we have a story called The Frog's Well in Acton Burnell, where the devil is said to preside in toad form along with two other imps. He's seldomly seen, but his imps are always seen. But it's interesting that the devil here is attached to this well that has Christian aspects to it. So there's always something other attached to these Christian wells.
There's a grim tale, the devil and his grandmother, or the devil and the three hares. And
yes,
in that, one of the prophecies that is obtained from the devil is of a giant toad that's killing the well or killing the tree. That's really interesting. That combination right there. Yeah.
I love when I was reading that tale. It's one of the first ones I read of the Brothers Grimm. Actually, I couldn't help but make the connection. So the boy is born with a cowl, I think it is, and obviously that's a prophecy that in 14 years' time he has to marry the king's daughter, and he is cast away in a box after being given to the king. He's cast away in the river. I can't help but make the connection to the same way that Taliesin or Gwion Bach was cast away into the waters after being given birth to by Ceridwen, who is the Welsh witch goddess. I don't know if you're familiar with that story. It's a very fabulous story, but yeah, there's so many connections there. And the thing that's surprising about that story actually is the devil has a grandmother. Yeah.
Who is she?
So maybe we can relate to the devil in that aspect, the grandmother who's always plucking at our hair.
And even the devil's sooty brother, where the soldier now is peeking into the cauldrons in the underworld. I thought of like the raid on Onwin and the raid for the cauldron of the other world. And the tales are very different, but this idea of going to the underworld and seeking out the cauldrons.
Yes.
Dave, how about yourself? How these stories could influence your craft?
Oh, I think very much so. I mean, even to the point that if you look to the nature spirits that are utilized within witchcraft, like Pan, Cernunnos, those are embodiments, incarnations of this devil to a degree, but more along the lines of the nature spirits. I mean, I'm not like most Southerners. I'm not afraid to go into the woods alone at night, for fear of the devil coming after me. I mean, trust me, I grew up with stories about the Booger Woods where demons and pigs and everything else chased people through woods.
Sounds like a fabulous Saturday night.
Oh yeah, my grandmother used to tell me stories about the Booger Woods, where
It's always our
this
grandmothers.
this one little area of woods nobody could go through, because if you did, the devil himself resided in those woods and would torment you as you went through.
Mhm.
But I've found ways. I tend to look at the devil as the liberator in my own craft. Within my craft, those nature spirits have offered me more freedom than I ever experienced when I was working in the Christian church.
Mm.
I mean, like I said, I did my share of witching behind the pulpit. But even as a pastor, I don't think I saw the devil as evil incarnate, because growing up, folk magic here encompasses both.
Absolutely.
There's not it's not so cut and dry good and evil. I mean, I've seen Appalachian folk witches use the Bible for spell work, but then again, I've also seen them call on the devil or the nature spirits. So, I mean, it's more of it's a nice culmination of the two.
Mm. I was just going off of that actually as well. I forgot to mention I do incorporate that into my practice, the more theoretical, operative forms of magic. So you'll find in our folk traditions and folk magic that yes, the Bible is included in it as a form of spell casting. So I don't know if you have it in the Appalachian region, but we have things like bibliomancy where we can tell the fortunes, or where we can detect a thief with the Bible. And it's passed through the narrative of the people at the time. Folk magic is inherently the magic of the people, and we have to remember that they were inherently Christian. And so the magic there is going to be Christian because that's believed where the magic was rooted from. But we can see that as not necessarily being related to the whole doctrine of, oh, you have to be a Christian to work this, I can't use this, but we can use it. It's a reclamation of this. So within my folklore, we have certain ways that we can summon the devil, all these different types of nature spirits, and that is the reversal of the norms. So I'm sure it's found across many folk traditions actually, to summon the devil, you have to trace around a church a certain amount of times, sometimes backwards, repeating the Lord's Prayer in reverse. So obviously you will incorporate that into the practice. There's also different things as well, actually, that you'll see as protection charms against the devil, but when you look at them from a more deeper perspective, you see that as protection against anyone or any other nature spirit. Like, we have to remember that nature spirits are not necessarily the personification of our own human morals. They have a different emotion, they have a different temperament to us. So one of the aspects I love to incorporate is that the elder tree is associated with the devil here, and that to burn it would have him summoned down your chimney, and that it was considered bad luck to bring it into your home. So in respects of that, I see interpreting it from a modern day perspective, because obviously folk traditions change and they adapt, and that's a beautiful thing. From a modern tradition, I see the elder tree as the tree of the devil that I would never disrespect by bringing it into my home. I'd rather see it restored back to its natural state. But it's interesting because you'll see the same thing incorporated with the elder tree in apotropaic magic, where the elder leaf combined with oak leaf or dock leaf is mixed together into like almost like a poultice or a balm, and it's scribbled upon the thresholds of doorways and fireplaces to stop evil witches or the devil coming into your home. So burning the wood when you burn the wood or bring the wood into the home, it brings the devil in, but when you use the leaves, it takes the devil out. So you can see that this is a very contradictory tree that we can't necessarily understand, but we can endeavor to do so by gaining that sacred reciprocity with it, having that interconnected relationship with it. And there are other aspects as well that come with the devil. So we have things like the Rowan cross, similar aspects, using it as a charm to keep the devil away or fairies away. But then you can use it in other aspects as well that incorporate the devil more into it. Or certain herbs as well. Certain herbs are associated with the devil, like I said. So one of them here is the devil's puffball, which is a mushroom. When you use that, it's almost as if you're calling upon the devil's power to act through you as a conduit, in which the puffball mushroom was made into a powder and put into drinks in order to make someone fall in love with you. I don't recommend, if anyone's listening, to do that. Please don't do that. That's roofing. We don't condone that. But that was what was done. That was what was believed, and it's almost seemed the devil would be given that power to that specific fungi, and that you could use it for that magical practice. So when you interpret in a modern day folklore, you see that, okay, the devil's puffball is a natural element that has a correspondence of love attached to it, so you can use that within love spells or love divination. But obviously, if you're going out and foraging for things that are associated with the devil, you have to be cautious. Obviously, some things are poisonous and toxic, but one of them I actually do love as well. last bit I'll say about that one is nettle. So in our folk belief, we say that the devil, wherever he treads, he leaves a pile of nettles in his wake. But we also see the correspondence of nettle being attached to protection because of the stinging. It keeps things away. So we can incorporate that, even though it's a devil-associated plant, we can incorporate it into a practice. The same with the blackcurrant or the blackberry. At a certain time around Michaelmas, which is the September region, we can't pick that berry anymore because the devil basically wheezes on it, or urinates on it, as petty revenge being cast out of heaven. And that gives us a specific time period in which we can gather and collect the berry. So we incorporate that into a practice to say, okay, the devil urinates on this berry at this time, we can't pick it. And it's true because, as you see in September, they start to wilt the wither, they're no good. So there are so many different ways to incorporate the devil or the collective spirits that we call the devil into our practice as modern day witches, pagans, or however we identify from a spiritual aspect.
One of the points of this series of discussions is that we could use the Brothers Grimm's household tales, similar to how historical witches used the Bible. And with that, like when our friend Reverend Laura Gonzalez is in the discussion, she'll perform a bibliomancy from the tales. And Dave often gives us a sacred reading of the tale as well. Did you have something prepared for us, Dave?
Actually, I did, and it falls along the last line of the text. It's where, if you look at the last paragraph in the last line, "That's all right with me," answered the peasant. When planting time came, the peasant didn't plant turnips again, but wheat. The crop ripened. The peasant went into the field and cut the full stalks off at the ground level. When the devil came, he found nothing but the stubble, and he angrily disappeared into a chasm in a cliff. And then the last sentence, "That's the way one has to deal with foxes," said the peasant. Then he carried away the treasure. How many times in our life do we deal with foxes? So I look at this, and the peasant found a workaround. He wanted all the spoils. He set about to trick the devil, because in the first sentence of this story, it said this peasant was a trickster. So we knew what to expect from the get-go. And the devil looked at the peasant and he's like, "I see the potential here for me to win." But the peasant, and I think the choice of the crops is so funny, because if you look at the history of the turnip, and basically it's a root vegetable, and the first harvest was under the ground, so he got to the root of the issues. The second crop was the wheat. And if you look at wheat's used to make bread, it's used to do so many things to nourish the body. Thinking about the foxes and growing up, we always had chickens. You always had to think 2 steps ahead of the fox. You either had to plant the fence under the ground so that he couldn't dig for it. You had to make sure that the chickens, it was always a process of preparation. So that tells me here, this peasant was prepared. It wasn't a fly by the seat of your pants thing. He was prepared for this. So I think this is a lesson in preparation for us. Where do we go from here? What foxes do we need to outsmart? What foxes do you have in your life that you need to stay 2 steps ahead of?
That's so funny, because remember in our other story, was it the Golden Bird, where the fox is the trickster that actually helps the youngest son throughout the story.
And I thought about that reading that last line too.
Yeah. Yeah. Brett, was there anything you were hoping to discuss that we didn't get to?
No, I think we pretty much covered it, to be fair. I think the one thing I want to drill in about when people look at these folk tales about the devil and they have this sense of fear about them, I think you have to look upon the wider aspects of what folklore actually is. Folklore is the glue that binds us. It's the continuity of culture, of heritage, of stories, and of people. We are fashioned together through these stories that, tell us to avoid the dark, tell us to stay clear of certain things, and they project these values to us that keep us safe within the world that always seeks to destroy us, but ultimately helps us prosper. And I think by looking into these folktales, we are the patronages or guardians of these, and we have to preserve them and carry them on, allowing for people to have the same wisdom bestowed to them as we did to us. And I think it's so important that we shouldn't forget that just because it's attached to the devil, that we should forget about it because it's regarded as evil. We should always carry on these stories and keep telling them because there is a sense of wonder to them. There's a sense of enchantment to them.
Thank you. This was such a unfortunately rare opportunity for us in the US to hear of the Welsh folklore firsthand. And so thank you so much for joining us on the talk.
No, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome. Dave, did you want to say anything else before we close out tonight?
This has been thrilling for me. I've followed Brett and Moss on Instagram for a while, and have been friends with them on Facebook. And to hear the similarities between the Welsh tradition and the Appalachian traditions and the folklore it's been thrilling for me.
Again, one of the reasons we're going through these tales is to propose them as able to work with and look at as sacred text and filling us with wonder so that we can keep a magical mindset. And with that, may all your travels in fairy be filled with wonder.